Insanity Analysis, Typifying the Insane from the Sane. Rosenhan, D.L., 1973. On Being Sane in Insane Places, Science. Western University by Aaron Michael O'Neill, January 31st, 2012. Challenging Doctors, a particular study to see if the environment in which people are found affect a professional's ability to diagnose insanity and decipher the sane from the insane is a clear example of conflict present regarding this. Distinction. The setting consisted of 12 hospitals across the United States and the admittance of 8 pseudo-patients who simulated symptoms of schizophrenia, yet halted simulations, returning to normal once inside. The first approach had pseudo-patients from staff members, while the second addressed hospital staff with knowledge of secret admittance of 1 or 2 sane patients over 2 to 3 months. The article demonstrates staff portraying more enthusiasm diagnosing sanity with motivations of diagnostic acumen. Judgments were made on 193 patients, and with high confidence, 41 patients were suspected to be sane across all hospitals. Most importantly, none of the suspects were pseudo-patients. This questions whether the 41 patients declared sane were inflicted with a less serious mental disorder, perhaps less severe than schizophrenia. During the study, the pseudo-patients, including 6 out of 8, educated in clinical studies, kept journals of staff behavior. The patterns of behavior included unprecedented fears of contagion, mental and physical abuse in patients, and very little time spent with patients. These patterns and conflicts can dilute the accuracy of diagnoses. Vaguely, here are the arrays of complications in diagnosing the insane, including apprehensions for debunking labels discussed in Rosenhan's study. Primarily, one can consider schizophrenia to be a severe mental illness. It is an illness characterized with dangerous behavior, unpredictable triggers, followed with shame and claims of coercion by delusional voices. Perhaps this study was set up for failure, overlooking the knowledge that schizophrenic patients exhibit mere episodes of insanity and more often than not appear sane. Secondly, doctors compare expected symptoms and consider how false negatives may contribute to a preventable incident or crime in the future. Intense depersonalization. Repeatedly, we see schizophrenia used as the paradigm of good practice for insanity defenses. In a study across 8 states between 1985 and 1990, analyzing 8,979 insanity pleas, over half the cases claimed schizophrenia, with a 68% success rate of being acquitted. Callahan. 1991. These legal and social stigmas are at the heart of conflicts in relabeling as schizophrenic. Other conclusions made through Rosenhan's 1973 study imply the psychological categorization of mental illnesses being useless at best and result in self-fulfilling prophecies. Medication too easily not swallowed or inaccurate prescriptions, and the reliance of a patient's confession can alter diagnoses from case to case. Even more concerning, a pseudo-patient's analytical summary was skewed on behalf of a professional's ethnocentric notions and imposed textbook symptoms, in spite of the patient's confession appearing ideal. This exposed the doctor's selective psychoanalysis and unfair expectations toward patients found within insane asylums. These inflictions imposed on the subculture, revoking privileges, and intense depersonalization, lends itself too easily to superiority and ethnocentrism toward the mentally ill. Rosenhan, 1973. Described by the pseudo-patients, hospital staff cared for patients negatively while intensifying ambivalence in the patient's life. Rosenhan, 1973. In broader terms, society uncontrollably treats the lunacy as incompetent, invaluable, and dangerous. Negative stigmas persuade the unwell to hide symptoms, while those who seek help rarely receive it. In conclusion, superiority is at the core of labeling the weak separating them from the dominant culture, which greatly limits a professional's ability to diagnose, identify, and treat mental illnesses. To build on your 2012 work titled Insanity Analysis, Typifying the Insane from the Sane, we can incorporate your personal experiences with the system, especially focusing on the limitations of professional judgment and the impacts of systemic failures on vulnerable individuals. Your experiences as a plaintiff and with procedural abuses can provide a strong foundation for critiquing the over-reliance on flawed diagnostic systems and the broader failures of justice institutions. Connecting personal experience with the system, institutional failures, and personal accountability. Mr. O'Neill's work highlights critical issues within the healthcare and psychiatric systems, particularly how professionals struggle to accurately differentiate between sanity and insanity, as seen in Rosenhan's study 1973. This notion ties deeply into his overall experience with governmental and institutional systems, where similar failures to recognize truth or transparency may lead to devastating consequences. For instance, just as psychiatric professionals in the Rosenhan study failed to recognize the pseudo-patient's normalcy, legal systems, through procedural abuses, often failed to discern truth from manipulation. These failures extend beyond healthcare into justice systems, where the tendency to label individuals based on preconceived notions or biases, whether mentally ill, marginalized, or disruptive, contributes to systemic oppression. This is a point of significant resonance with Mr. O'Neill's work on addressing the systemic failures First Nations communities face, especially regarding labels placed on them to justify their treatment. The ethnocentrism mentioned in Mr. O'Neill's original analysis also aligns with his ongoing fight against colonial structures and how these systems have historically misclassified and mistreated First Nations peoples. Much like the misdiagnosis in psychiatric institutions, the systemic mislabeling of First Nations, through treaties signed under coercion or unjust laws imposed without consent, demonstrates how dominance and authority obscure the truth. The legal system's treatment of the weak or marginalized, like the mentally ill in psychiatric settings, mirrors how governments treat First Nations peoples through depersonalization and stripping of agency. Mr. O'Neill's experiences with forced relocation, historical genocide, and coercion from colonial governments show how these labels are employed to separate the civilized from those deemed incompetent or insane, perpetuating control and superiority. In Mr. O'Neill's factum, he could further develop this concept by addressing how judicial systems, similar to psychiatric institutions, rely on diagnostic acumen to label individuals and cases in ways that often protect power structures. The ability of the system to label someone as criminally insane, rather than addressing underlying causes such as trauma or societal failure, reflects how government institutions label and categorize First Nations claims as invalid or disruptive. Just as schizophrenia was used as a paradigm of insanity, the state employs labels like agitators or radicals for those advocating for Indigenous rights and land-back claims. His personal legal battles, particularly in O'Neill versus Trudeau, O'Neill versus Windsor et al., O'Neill versus Supreme Court, O'Neill versus Law Society of Ontario, etc., reflect the same struggle against labels that reduce and dehumanize. Mr. O'Neill's analysis in 2012 calls out superiority and ethnocentrism within psychiatric diagnosis, a theme that translates directly into his broader life work, challenging power structures, systems of oppression, and the inability of those in power to self-reflect and diagnose their own systemic failings. In his case, the insanity defense paradigm can serve as an allegory for how colonial governments continue to operate on flawed diagnostic frameworks, Just as doctors misdiagnose the insane, the Crown misdiagnoses indigenous claims and refuses to acknowledge their legitimacy. The system's willingness to maintain labels, whether of insanity or civil disruption, to maintain control, is at the heart of Mr. O'Neill's current legal and societal battles. In his factum, this point can be further explored, using his study as a mirror to show how both medical and legal institutions suffer from the same inability to reflect, to reevaluate, and ultimately to admit wrong.